equipping you to think well about culture and create conversations that lead to wisdom. This is the THINQ Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the THINQ Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and we hope you're having a great week. Today we are going to talk about something that has been for 5 years a conversation around all the events we've hosted with THINQ, and it's around censorship. The topic's the censorship trend. And if you've been paying attention over these last many years, you've seen more and more censorship start to show up in our society. And Ryan Bangert is senior counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom. Perhaps you've heard of ADF. They're the world's largest legal organization committed to protecting religious freedom, free speech, the sanctity of life, marriage and family, parental rights. You name it, this organization has been at the front lines. They've argued before the Supreme Court, multiple cases, won multiple cases. Very faithful to try to continue to carve out what the founders in American life created was this space where free speech and freedom of association could exist. Censorship's a topic also that's been in the news. In the last few weeks, Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan famously to talk about how Meta is now doing away with their fact checkers and really rethinking how the government tried to influence them and other social media companies to really take down posts, even when those posts were true. We saw that happening throughout COVID, and in multiple scenarios, it's now the facts are that our government tried to censor us. And so Ryan lays out how we as Christians haven't necessarily done a good job of explaining the what and the why of freedom of speech. And so to a new generation, it's going to be important to talk about these ideas, to better understand why your voice matters and why you have to protect the freedom of speech. Why, when you look at the amendments, the First Amendment is the amendment that deals with this. And there's a reason it's first, because if you lose the right to talk about your beliefs, if you lose the right to talk about ideas that matter to you, or to give your opinion, no matter how much people disagree with it or think it's wrong or think it's even untrue, you have that right as a human being to talk about things from your freedom of conscience, and we can never let that right go away. And so let's listen into Ryan Bangert as he helps educate us a bit on the censorship trend, and most importantly, how do we become the kinds of people that continue to empower others to share their voice?
So do you believe in freedom of speech? Yeah, it's an easy question, right? But for a lot of Americans today, it's not so simple. 54% of students on college campuses today say that they believe it's appropriate to block and prevent other students from attending a controversial campus speech. And 32% say it's okay to use violence to do that. 44% of millennials today believe that declining to use someone's chosen pronouns should be prosecuted as a criminal offense. 62% of the folks that were surveyed by Cato Institute recently said they're afraid that what they say may get them fired. Now, this confusion, this aversion to free speech, it shouldn't be surprising to us. Why is that? Because as Christians, we haven't done a great job all the time of catechizing and explaining the what and the why of freedom of speech. And we need to change that. We need to change that today. We need to reclaim freedom of speech. And that begins with a right understanding of human nature. We're made in God's image. And what does that mean? It means we were made to seek and to speak the truth. As rational agents made in God's image, He endowed us with creativity, with speech, with the ability to engage in rational conversation. And we use those gifts to worship God. We use those gifts to proclaim truth, and we use those gifts to fulfill the Great Commission. That means that speech is integral to our nature and to our purpose. But what that doesn't mean is that speech is a cover for evil. That's the great lie that's been spread by modern society, that freedom of speech is simply code for bigotry and hatred. But that's simply not true. As the great Christian philosopher and theologian Carl F.H. Henry said, what moderns call human rights are the contingent flip side of divine duties. Our speech is ultimately measured by whether it honors God and advances the truth. Now, in this imperfect world, of course, our understanding is limited. As Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. And so we must engage in conversation, debate, and yes, sometimes even conflict to get to the truth. And that's why our framers of the Constitution wrote the First Amendment. They wrote that to constrain the government's power to dictate orthodoxy, to bind our conscience, and to establish truth for everyone. And why is that important? It's important because right now, truth always meets opposition. Do you feel that in your life today? Truth collides with error. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul told the disciples in Corinth, he was beaten, he was stoned, he was persecuted constantly, all for spreading the gospel. And much like in Roman times, those things happen even today. And how do they happen? Usually at the hands of government. Government trying to push back against voices that oppose its orthodoxy. Take, for example, Pastor Wang Yi in China. He is serving a 9-year sentence today. Why? Because the state of China said that he was inciting subversion of state power. His crime? Simply standing firmly on the principle of freedom of conscience and a refusal to let the state government limit the gospel. Take Brazil. A single judge in the nation of Brazil just this summer banished the platform X from the country, imposing fines of thousands of dollars on anyone who dared to access it. Why? Because the judge wrote in his opinion he was afraid that X might negatively influence the election by favoring one political group over the other. I think that's what elections are all about, right? But even in Western countries today, we're seeing this censorship trend. Take Adam Smith Connor, a military veteran and father who was prosecuted for thought crimes in the UK. Why? Because he violated a law that created a buffer zone around abortion clinics. And he simply stood there and silently prayed, without speaking a word, without holding a sign, silently prayed. And for that, he was prosecuted and convicted of a thought crime. What about in Australia? This is Billboard Chris. Billboard Chris, as you can see, likes to wear sandwich boards protesting gender ideology. He's a Canadian dad of 2. The E-Safety Commission in Australia ordered X to drop and banish one of his posts. What did the post say? It simply retweeted a Daily Mail article that explained some of the very inappropriate conduct that was being engaged in by a man who had recently been appointed by the WHO to its panel of experts on global transgender policy, a man named Teddy Cook. That was considered inappropriate by the government of Australia. Or what about Belgium? This is my colleague, Paul Coleman, standing in the background. The National Conservatism Conference held a conference in Brussels just this past spring. And the government of Belgium, the mayor of Brussels, forced 2 hotels to cancel the contracts for the convention. The third refused to bend the knee. That's what the mayor do? Ordered in police to block the entrance to the conference. These are the police officers that were sent by the mayor to block the conference. What was the crime of the national conservatism movement? Well, in the words of the government, they were engaging in Eurosceptic ideas such as opposing legalization of abortion and opposing same-sex unions. That's why they had to be blocked and shut down.
I'm Gabe Lyons, president of THINQ, and I want to invite you to join us for our first ever THINQ Summit 2025, coming to Nashville October 2nd to 4th. For 20 years, we've been creating spaces for leaders to come together, but we've never created a space like this. The amount of interaction, the amount of experiences, the keynote talks, the workshops, the skills you're going to learn, the new friends you're going to walk out of the room with is just going to be second to none. And so as you're making your plans for 2025, put on your calendar now, Thursday, October 2nd through Saturday, October 4th. Go to our website at thinkmedia.com/summit and learn all about the ways you're going to learn and interact with so many different leaders from around this nation. Culture changes when leaders from different channels of culture come together in common purpose. We designed this summit as a space that's not just about content, but it's about relationships. It's about meeting other leaders that will inspire you, encourage you, and ultimately create culture together. Join us in October 2nd to 4th for THINQ Summit 2025. Learn more at thinkmedia.com/summit.
Now, ADF represents, in some way, all of the folks that I just talked about. But is that happening today? Is that happening today in the United States? Set aside the Western countries. What about the United States? Are we experiencing this censorship trend here? Well, let's give you a few examples. That's Seth Dillon, the owner of the Babylon Bee. Many of you probably know who he is. Well, there was a post by someone named Mr. Reagan USA who posted a parody video of Kamala Harris's acceptance speech on Twitter. And Governor Newsom in California said, that's unacceptable, we have to take it down. The California legislature responded by passing not one but two laws limiting parody, political satire. The Babylon Bee, of course, that's all they do. That would destroy their business. So we sued on their behalf. And that case just started about a month ago. What about Kaylee Childs? Probably don't know who she is. She's a counselor in Colorado who counsels gender dysphoric youth. And she wants to counsel them into alignment, their gender identities into alignment with their biological sex. The state of California said, you can't do that. It's illegal to do that. Why? Because under Colorado law, you may only counsel, if you're a licensed counselor, counsel youth into a transgender lifestyle. That's the law in Colorado. We've asked the Supreme Court to hear her case. Well, one more example, Dr. Fox. In my home city of Austin, Texas, he's a businessman, a pastor, and until recently, the volunteer fire chaplain at the Austin Fire Department, but no longer. Why is that? Because he wrote a post on his own personal ministry blog on his own time that said under a biblical view of sex, men should not be competing against women in sports. And for that, he was terminated from his job as the Austin Fire Department chaplain. Now, these examples are just examples. I could tell you dozens of more stories about teachers who have been fired because they refused, they could not in good conscience use pronouns and language that affirmed a lie. I can tell you a story about professors who have had their careers derailed because they refused to speak untruths about gender ideology. These are all stories that are happening today. What do these people have in common? What is the common thread that unites them all? It is simply this. They understand that freedom of speech is foundational to freedom of mind, body, and soul. In his work, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, the psychologist Matthias Desmond explains that in our age, when large groups of people are subject to mass formation, the hypnotic commitment to false ideologies, only courageous truth-telling can break the spell. Alexander Solzhenitsyn recognized this when he wrote Live Not by Lies. He cautioned us. He said this, even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let their rule not hold through me. That is the line that connects all of the clients I've talked to about today. They understand that they can speak the truth, but it must come at the cost of even their own standing, convenience, and sometimes their freedom. But that's what's necessary today in order to advance the truth. And why is that important? Because the freedom to speak creates space for the truest freedom of all, and that is the freedom that's profoundly given by the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And that's why ADF exists. We exist to advance the God-given right to live and speak the truth, to keep the door open for the gospel. That's why we represent all of these clients, because we understand that the stand they're taking today is a stand for freedom and a stand for truth that has to be preserved, not just for this generation, but for generations to come. As our Lord and Savior said, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth. And how does it end? The truth will set you free. Amen. Thank you very much.
Hello, and Ryan said, our speech is ultimately measured by whether it honors God and advances the truth. I mean, that is good speech, right? Now, bad speech is allowed too, but we as Christians want to think about what is the most uplifting and encouraging speech. That's it, whether it honors God and advances the truth. He gave so many examples in the U.S. and across the world of ways people are being kept from exercising their right to free speech, but then reminds us that the only way to break through that and break the spell is courageous truth-telling. So we all should take, I think, his advice. We got to resist censorship, even if it costs us our standing convenience or even our freedom at times. We have to be willing to give voice to this. We've had so many examples of that at our Culture Summit, of leaders who've been faithful to speak truth, even in a cultural moment where it was unpopular. And I think people are feeling that, right? The tide has changed. People are recognizing, I'm not going to quiet myself anymore. In fact, I was self-censoring. And in my self-censoring, I found myself losing a part of who I was because I wasn't speaking the truth. If that's a feeling that you've had, I think so many other people are waking up to that and they're going, no more. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to go through another season where I feel the pressure socially to not speak to what I believe to be true. Doesn't mean we should be unkind. It just means that with respect, with kindness, when we can, let's present what we believe to be true and let's not self censor. So, if you want to learn more, I encourage you to look at the show notes. You can see more about Alliance Defending Freedom. If you're an organization, you're a church, and you're wrestling with some of these topics, or perhaps you're in a state where you feel like you really don't have the same rights that other states have, and on religious grounds, you want to challenge those, they're a perfect organization to reach out to get all of their advice because they've seen it all and they would have great encouragement for you. They have incredible resources for people who are trying to really work to expand what religious freedom ought to be like, not just for Christians, but for anyone of any religion. Well, in closing, I want to remind you that coming up October 2nd to 4th is our THINQ Summit 2025. We've announced it. You've probably seen this in your inbox, but if you haven't heard about this, I want you to go to the show notes, click on THINQ Summit 2025, and just check out what's going to happen in Nashville over these 3 days. It's going to be amazing. 2,500 leaders of all generations coming together. We're going to have keynote talks. We're going to have talkbacks, experiences, recreation like pickleball tournaments. I mean, it's going to be fun. It's going to be engaging. Your mind's going to be stretched. We're going to have music, film screenings. It's going to be like this mix of incredible talks with experience. And we can't wait to put this on for you. Our team has been planning and praying into this for the last year. And check out the website. Go see some of those experiences, the workshops, the skills you're going to learn. But more importantly, what it's going to do is create space where a large number of leaders in every channel of culture can overlap, can build friendships, can learn together, can create together, can collaborate. Because we know historically cultures change when leaders from every channel of culture come together and have common purpose. And so we're called to create spaces like that. We've been doing it for over 20 years, and we don't want you to miss it. If you've never been to one of our culture summits, this is going to be the one because we're launching a whole new way of doing it. It's going to be exciting, engaging, and you're not going to want to miss it. So join us October 2nd to 4th in Nashville for THINQ Summit 2025.